Welcome to a Trekzone conversation. Matt Miller with you. Well, it's Tuesday, which means it's Talkin Science time. Dr. Brad Tucker is waiting for me, and on the other side of this opener, he's going to have the latest science and space news.
With Dr. Brad Tucker and Matt Miller, this is Talkin Science on Trekzone.
Well, he's here on the other side of Skype. Dr. Brad Tucker, welcome to Talkin Science for another week.
Yeah, how's it going?
Really good. I'm talking to you from the past. You're in the future. I think that's how daylight saving works, isn't it?
That's exactly how it works. And both in practice and in reality, given our locations.
Well, let's dive straight into the headlines because it's a bumper show. And the NASA lander on Mars has captured quite a few Marsquakes in the last year.
Yeah, so InSight has been on Mars for about a year. And it was really exciting when the first potential Marsquake was heard or detected back in April. And it appears that there's been over 100 events that InSight has measured, and at least 24 are pretty clear to be Martian Marsquakes, as they're called, which is really exciting given we didn't know about this literally a year ago.
So what's this telling us about the red planet?
Well, so this is interesting, right? You know, we always think that is the Earth the only place that is tectonically active? Are we the only thing that has these tectonic quakes? So we know the moon has quakes, but they're a bit different. We actually now know it's because the gravity between the two, Earth and the moon, is shriveling it. But what is Mars like? And the fact that is, these are tectonic activity, the best we can see and the best we can measure. They vary in strengths. They vary in appear to be locations. That's one of the big things is they're trying to figure out at the depths and kind of where they're originating from, like measuring if there's fault lines or anything like that. Really shows that Mars, in a lot of ways, is really like Earth. You know, always a big question is what's going on underneath the surface. And in the case is, well, maybe we are very similar underneath the surface.
And I guess this all helps for our future Mars missions so that we know what we're getting into. And it's not going to be like that movie with I'm forgetting the name here, but the face on on Mars was actually
the Val Kilmer one.
Yes, I think it was. Yeah.
Because like the face of Mars was this alien civilization or something like that.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Well, this is true, right? If we're going to build things on Mars, they have to survive, and you have to know what the ground is like. And we do know Mars quakes are more intense and therefore more violent. So it's not that the power is different necessarily, or that they have bigger, what we say is Richter scale magnitudes. They are more intense because the density of the ground is different. So they can last longer and are more intense, which means they ultimately end up being more violent. So knowing how often they occur, the range of the intensities, all that sort of stuff will help future Mars missions. The last thing you want is to build on the San Andreas version of Mars and it just be completely destroyed. And we don't know that. And that's one of the big goals of InSight, has been measuring these Mars quakes.
It just really proves that there's a lot more to creating a habitat on another world than just going there and planting a flag.
That's right. As we talked about last week or the week before about making cement, it's all of these little things. You just don't show up and be like, hey, we're going to build a civilization here, right? That's one of the things. Even dating back to the moon, they were worried, I think, as we talked about in the anniversary special, of the lander sinking into the ground because they didn't know how dense it was. One of the other probes of InSight has been this drill that's trying to drill down and take essentially Mars's temperature. And it's really not making it. It was supposed to go like 15 meters, and it's only made it about 6 centimeters or something like that. It is because the ground is just really hard to get through. So it's all these little things that you have to know what you're getting into before you get into it.
Get exclusive access to podcast and behind-the-scenes info by becoming a member on Patreon today. Supporting Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek gets even better with membership starting at just $1 per month. Jump over to patreon.com/TrekZoneOrg.au.
Okay, well, let's head to a galactic scale now, and the Milky Way is in perilous danger in about 4 billion years.
Yeah, a mere 4 billion years.
We'll still be around talking science by then, won't we?
That's right. So the cool thing is that our neighbor galaxy, Andromeda, we know it's a big galaxy. It's about 3 times the size of the Earth, or the Milky Way, rather. And we know that we're slowly going to be collided with it. One of the big questions is just how much, so to speak, damage has Andromeda done in the past? How many galaxies have it swallowed? How much has it left behind? And so a new result has shown that there was a number of galaxies 10 billion years ago that Andromeda swallowed up. So it kind of gives a clue about what's going to happen in that untimely event in 4 billion years to the Earth.
Do we know just how many galaxies it's swallowed up, Brad?
Well, so it's hard to say exactly how many. We know there's been a few big ones that it has in the past. One was called Andromeda 32P, which we think was a really big one. There is clear evidence of this recent paper that's come out that's shown there was 2 medium-sized galaxies. We know the Milky Way has swallowed probably anywhere between 10 and 20 galaxies, and these are really small dwarf galaxies, as we call them. So it's a big question of seeing the bigger galaxy interactions in what Andromeda does. And we know that in 4 billion years, when we start to merge, it's not going to be necessarily that solar systems are colliding, but really that it's kind of a mesh, right? The 2 galaxies swirl around, and eventually we stop existing in the way we think and just become a bigger galaxy. But the big thing is those 2 supermassive black holes in the center of those galaxies will collide to form an even bigger black hole.
That's kind of scary. I guess it will mean the end for Earth at that point.
Well, I mean, yeah, the sun will have destroyed us anyways, so we don't have to worry about it. And I guess that's the thing is we don't understand, when these galaxies merge, they kind of are turbulent. They kind of mix up the area, so they actually create new stars, and therefore new solar systems. What actually happens to the existing ones, we don't really know. It will be turbulent, and, where we end up, how we collide, do we hit near an area of a lot of gravity or something different that slings us out or changes us? These are all these little questions that we don't really know about, but trying to see kind of the wake of debris that Andromeda's left behind gives us a bit of a clue.
And it's really telling us something about the universe as a whole as well, isn't it? Where we're heading and how we're getting there.
Yeah, because, we see lots of these galaxies at different stages. So by being able to see our neighboring ones and how it relates to us, it tells us the picture of how galaxies assemble, which tells us the picture of how stars assemble, which tells us the picture of how planets assemble. It is all related in a very big cosmic chorus, essentially.
New content is being added all the time to Trekzone's YouTube channel, Talking Science, with Dr. Brad Tucker on Tuesdays, Trekzone Live on Thursdays, and a Trekzone Conversation on Saturdays. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe and ring the bell to get fresh public releases.
Well, speaking of those planets, astronomers have discovered a huge exoplanet that shouldn't exist.
Yeah, so when we look at the sizes of planets, we think there's kind of a limit to how big a planet could be around a certain type of star. And that simply is based on the way gravity and the material would pull it together to form. And that really becomes part of the question. Is there kind of a cutoff where you start becoming a star rather than a planet? Where is that limit? And so we think there's always a certain limit of how big a planet could be, but a new one kind of throws this into the air because it appears to be too big for the star it orbits.
And the planet in question is GJ3512b. It's around half the size of Jupiter. So I guess this is the question, isn't it? As you're saying, when does a star become a star and a planet stop becoming a planet? Will this throw into doubt some of the findings that we've made with exoplanets?
Well, I think it would almost open up the parameter space of where planets exist. To put in perspective, Jupiter's about 1,000th the masses of the sun. So the sun is 1,000 times heavier than Jupiter is. But the star GJ3512 is only about 250 times compared to that planet. So it's about, it's actually fairly different. And so we thought that there was this cutoff. And so maybe it just means that planets and stars form in a more elegant way, in the sense that maybe that very first big planet is actually just a star that didn't turn in, and then there's a different ratio for the other planets. Again, when we look at Jupiter and we think of Jupiter as being a failed star, it didn't accumulate enough mass to create nuclear fusion and become a star, and that's what we know that process is. Where does that point happen, and really how does it affect whether it becomes a star or a planet? And also, how does it affect the other star? If there's only so much gas and dust around, and one pulls in a lot of gas into it to form a star, well, that won't leave a lot of else. So maybe it's also how many ingredients there are. We're really just tipping the iceberg of how planetary systems come to be, and finding more of these oddballs help.
You can get social with Trekzone. Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek is everywhere you are. Get the wrap-up on our Facebook page, keep in the loop on Twitter, and relive Trek episodes on Instagram. Just search for Trekzone.
And Brad, our last headline of the week, the centre of the Milky Way galaxy exploded when ancient human ancestors walked the Earth. We're talking a flare from the supermassive black hole at the centre of the galaxy. Do black holes flare, apparently?
Yeah, it's essentially they release big bursts of radio light and energy, sometimes when things fall in, other times when there's activity in the center of that black hole. We were talking about last week, these two big radio bubbles emitting from the center. It does appear there's another piece of evidence that says our black hole had a very definite period of activity millions of years ago. When it's active, it releases a whole bunch of stuff into space. This creates turmoil, creates new stars. But this big flare lasted hundreds of thousands of years. And this is in the period of human ancestors, so it wasn't a very far off thing.
And being that bright, is it visible light, or are we talking radio waves here?
So it would have been radio and gamma ray light. They do emit some visible light, and we see this in other galaxies. They emit lots of optical light that we can see with our telescopes. How bright that would have been, say in our own galaxy for our human ancestors, a bit hard to say. But given it would have lasted for hundreds of thousands of years, it would have changed the galaxy in a fairly important way by mixing it up, producing extra radiation and all sorts of things. So really, again, going to understand the history of our own galaxies, we were talking about with Andromeda colliding with our Milky Way, tells us a lot about what's going to happen to us in the future and how galaxies come and piece themselves together.
What could trigger such a huge explosion?
So it could have been a massive inflow of stars and gas, right? We do know things fall into a black hole. And ultimately, if a black hole pulls and swallows essentially everything in an area, it will go through periods where it's swallowing more. And then when it's kind of eaten up the area, so to speak, it will go through periods of less. So maybe there was just a bunch of stuff millions of years ago that the black hole swallowed and fell into it, and then it went through a quiet period. Maybe it triggered a whole bunch of activity of essentially stars exploding. It's a bit hard to say what exactly this flare would have been, other than we know a massive amount of energy being released by it, and you wouldn't have wanted to be around.
Well, I can imagine that research is continuing on that, and hopefully some of those questions will be answered soon.
Yeah, it is. And it's really just starting to tip the iceberg of looking at the history of our own galaxy. And it's an important thing, just as we look at the history of Earth, and it tells us, like we're talking about comparing to Mars, looking at the history of our Milky Way will allow us to compare us better to other galaxies to understand how they form.
Fantastic, Brad. Well, thanks as always for talking science, and we'll catch you next week with more headlines.
Sounds good.